So real briefly, the Ichimoku was created, it was first published late 60s, originally started in 1930s. The goal of it was to capture the majority of trends, capture trending moves. The guy who created it, Koichi Osada, believed that trending moves is where the most amount of profit is and can be made. And so he comes from a culture in Japan which is tend to be very patient, more concerned with efficiency, so they would rather trade less and get more profit per trade and have higher accuracy than trade more in lieu of having more trades, less accuracy to try and reach the same goal. To them, they're much more about efficiency and making the most out of each trade. And the Ichimoku was designed to generally capture 80% of the trade. And the thing about it is that that's the majority of what you want to catch in a trending move. Because the bottom line is the harder parts to make money in a trending environment is the last 10% and the first 10% of the move. It's the hardest part of a trending move to capture. Both because in the beginning it's hard to actually detect, hey, this really is a trend, and at the end that also takes a little bit of skill as well. It takes a lot of skill to really detect the very beginning of a trend and the end of a trend. And so Hosada's figuring was, let's just capture the lion's share of it because that's where really all the money is. And if you look at this last move here, that's pretty much how it plays itself out. 80% of the move is here and here. That's a good chunk of change right there. That's really, that's a little bit easier to make money inside this area than it is to make money inside here or inside here. And so that was one of the main goals, was to capture trending moves, ideally 80% of that particular trend or move. The other thing about it is that because it's very good at picking trends, it's also very good at detecting reversals. Now, in terms of detecting reversals, it's not necessarily trying to pick tops and bottoms per se. I use other methods to pick tops and bottoms, and I can do that pretty easily. It's not too complicated. But it does do a good job of picking up reversals through weeding out false signals and weeding out continuation signals, so that when the pair really does reverse, it really is saying, hey, this thing's done. The bottom line is that the Kumo structure is based upon previous price action. And so that previous price action can have an influence on future support and resistance. But I wouldn't use that as a strategy. I wouldn't use it as a major method. In fact, the correlation I'd probably say is relatively low. But it can happen from time to time, which is probably why you're noticing it. I need to explain to those of you that are new the construction of the Ichimoku cloud. So once you understand that, then you'll really understand all of what we're talking about to some degree, or at least you'll have the seeds to understand, or the soil to understand what we're talking about. So there are generally 4 components of the Ichimoku cloud that I recognize. The 5th one I do not. It's not that I don't recognize, I just don't use it. But the 4 components are this. The first one here is this white line. It's called the Tenkan-sen. It's like a price action line of sorts. Takes the last 9 periods, takes the high and the low last 9 periods, and what it does is it averages that, and then it puts it into a price action line. This Tenkan-sen is designed to gauge the underlying momentum of an instrument. And so it gauges the momentum of an instrument, and that can be very useful for telling you where it is, what's the instrument's likely to do, how it's going to respond, and so forth. We'll get a little further into how it actually has an effect upon trading and also the Ichimoku cloud. The next line that you see here is called the Kijun-sen. This will translate into trend line. And this is designed, as pretty much it says, it's designed to gauge the overall trend of the instrument. It's designed to tell you where the trend is, if it's contained or not contained. If it's flat, if it's climbing, if it's falling. That's what it's designed to do as a general gauge. Now that you understand those two, we can start to get into the Kumo itself, which is to me the most unique part of the Ichimoku cloud. This Kumo is the cloud, but it has two components here. The first part is this white line here. This white line is really, you take the red line and you take the white line, you divide it in half, shoot 26 time periods ahead, and it creates that value over there. So that's the white line over here, which has crossed down. Now, it's kind of interesting that it does that, because what it's doing is, what Osada did is, he took the underlying momentum, the thing that gauges the underlying momentum for the instrument, and then he takes the underlying gauge for the trend of that instrument, and then he says, okay, halfway in between the momentum and halfway in between the trend, we put those two values together, we shoot that into the future, because that should represent some sort of gauge for future support and resistance. This is kind of brilliant. He's really taking two underlying essences of price action and saying, this should have a representation or some sort of ability to detect future support and resistance. But he didn't just isolate that by itself. He created something that's called Senku Span A. He created something else called Senku Span B, which is this blue line here. And this blue line is based purely upon price action. It takes the highest high plus the lowest low over the last 52 time periods. Now we're on a daily chart, so that would be the equivalent of 52 candles, aka 2 months of price action. Should be IE, not AKA, but I use AKA a lot. So IE, 2 months of price action. And then what it does is it divides that in half, and then shoots that 26 time periods ahead. And that becomes known as Senku Span B. The shading in between is really just the shading between the two values. Now, this Kumo is kind of dynamic and unique. It changes over time. It has trajectory. It has a thickness or thinness to it. It can have it to where it's belly side up or belly side down. What that means is the Senku Span A is up or the Senku Span A is down. That can all have a gauge and a bearing on the Kumo. And the Kumo's main job is to identify or give you a gauge for support and resistance. Now that may be different from what you've been looking at support and resistance before, because maybe you've been playing with, say, Fibonacci's. And you pull up a Fibonacci from this last move, and you have 3 lines in the sand. And so there's something that says, well, support and resistance is just lines in the sand. Or you may have used something called pivot points. And you see these pivot points are horizontal lines. And they have the same approach to support and resistance. Support and resistance is based on lines in the sand. That is a Western concept. And so that is a Western view. And when I say Western, I'm including pretty much European, all of Europe and the Americas. That's the general view of support and resistance. Osada looks at it a little bit differently. He kind of deconstructs it and approaches it from a different perspective. He feels that support and resistance is based upon A, previous price action, and B, is not a line in the sand. To him, support and resistance, if it's based upon previous price action, has to be evolving, has to change over time, and probably is several layers deep. It's probably not just 135, 140, 145, 133.30. Or it's generally not like that. It generally looks at support and resistance as several layers thick.